Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Marc Steiner. Great to have you with us. We're about to talk with Janet Redman, who is the Greenpeace USA Climate and Energy Director. We're going to explore what this flip in the House means for the environment, energy movements, and more, and some of the governorships and what they mean. And Janet, welcome back. Great to have you with us here on the Real News, as always.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So, the House flipping, people thought that was going to happen, and it did. The question is, what is its significance?
Yeah, I think right off the bat, what this means is that there's not a blank check for Trump to continue pushing his deregulatory agenda, which is important for environmental protection across the board, but it's certainly important in the energy and climate realm because it means his energy dominance agenda doesn't move forward as quickly as it has been. He's been setting up expansion of the oil and gas industry, trying to revive the coal industry. We can talk about whether that's working or not, but it means that there's going to be at least a check on that power to just move deregulatory agendas forward.
Yeah, which you just said, I think, we don't get into detail with this, but I think that's one of the things that I've been saying for a while in leading up to this election, that if the Democrats take the House, it blunts the power.
That's right.
It helps keep it in check.
That's right, yeah. It means also, and we can go into specific races in a minute, but it means also that there's going to be a lot of opportunity for oversight and some investigations in House committees. So a number, again, as whenever the Congress switches, the House committee chairs will switch to be Democratic. Right. And there are a number of people waiting in the wings who've been climate champions or who've been at least champions of giving Donald Trump a hard time. You know, we've got people like Grijalva, who's poised to be the House Committee Chair on Natural Resources. He's very interesting. He's been very active in the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He's been talking about climate for a long time. He's thinking about, you know, pressing for more renewable energy production on public lands, thinking about how to dial back oil and gas production on public lands. Right,
because that's exactly what Trump is doing, is trying to push oil and gas production and cattle and everything else on federal land.
That's right. And so we've got some people now who can help slow that down. I think one of the priorities that he's talking about is making sure that the mining law from 1972, which was enacted as a way to, you know, protect public lands, but also put some resources aside for public use, would actually kind of be permanently reauthorized, so it doesn't have to go back every year and get reauthorized. So that's true. Also in the Appropriations Committee, we've got Betty McCollum, who the Appropriations Committee sounds kind of nerdy and boring, but it's the people who decide how the money flows out the door.
Maybe nerdy and boring, but that's where the money is.
That's right. So I think she's really framing her new role as potentially stopping the attacks on science, stopping the attacks on climate science and science more broadly. And that's, of course, really important for anything that has to do with climate and energy. She's going to, what we've heard about her office, is she's thinking about really making sure that the EPA and the Interior Department are doing their job well, protecting human health and using public resources wisely. The Department of Energy is a really interesting space, and a number of different committees where Democrats will now have interesting chairmanships. We're hearing people talk about really taking on Secretary of Interior Zinke right now, who is embroiled in a little bit of trouble, having some scandals. Not quite like Scott Pruitt yet, but. You know, it looks like perhaps he will leave office before we even get to this next Congress. But if that happens, that means we're going to see a whole new discussion about who's going to take his place.
Right.
And we would imagine that having a Democratic House means that will, you know, while they're not the body that actually
that's the Senate.
Right. Put someone in place, they'll be making sure there are checks and balances on what happens in the Department of Interior. So I think that's really important, kind of as part of the overall picture of what we're looking at right now, because of the flip in the House.
And before we went on the air, you were talking a bit about some of the new races, people who are coming in, who you think can be really important voices.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things we're seeing about this particular set of wins is that there are a number of people who are standing up and saying, we're ready to push back against the fossil fuel industry. So a really interesting piece that I saw was that 19 out of the 34 freshman Dems actually have taken something called the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge, which is a pledge that was released to everyone, Republicans, Democrats, from local races all the way up to the top, the highest races that were happening this cycle. And it just says, I promise not to take money from oil, gas, or coal companies or their cronies, basically, the industry associations. So that means there's a block now in the House that's not just climate friendly, but is actually saying we're resetting what climate championship means.
And even though clearly it's not near a majority in the House, but it's a majority of the new people who were elected by a bit, by a little bit, it also means that's the kind of force that could politically push that agenda and put it at the forefront of discussions.
That's exactly right.
And that's what, you know.
Part of what we're talking about right now, obviously, is, you know, it's the day after the 2018 cycle, but we're in the 2020 cycle now.
Yes, we are.
So we should be really clear that one of the things that's being communicated by Who Won is kind of what the agenda is moving forward. So, you know, we've been watching, I'm really interested in this group of 4 particular folks, Ocasio-Cortez, Omar, Tlaib, Delgado in New York, who've been talking about putting in place a Green New Deal. We talked about this a little bit before in thinking about how we're setting forward some of the ballot initiatives across the country. But I think this is a place where new members of Congress, new climate champions are really saying, it's not just that I believe that the climate science is real, which should be the lowest possible bar. It's saying what we need to build, actually, is a green economy that puts people to work, millions of people to work, creates public sector jobs, and puts the kind of economy in place that's good for the climate, but is good for our public health, is good for being able to drive on safe bridges, drink safe drinking water, et cetera. And they've been running on platforms that incorporate climate justice, the idea of a just transition for both workers and communities. And I think that's pretty exciting. I think that's something that we haven't seen before, and that's really new.
And they probably can also be part of that green economy push. I would think, knowing who these people are, that it's not just about people fighting for a living wage in this new work, but people fighting for a wage people can live on.
That's right. That's right.
Which is a big difference.
It's a big difference, you're right. And I think the other piece that's really interesting is they're also talking about not just building what we need, but starting to dial down what we can't continue to grow. So that's talking about building new renewable energy, but also saying there comes a point where we can't build new oil and gas if we want to stay within climate targets, basically the Paris Agreement, or another way of saying it is like not getting to climate catastrophe. We have to stop pumping more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we can't just build good stuff, we actually have to dial down the bad stuff. And these are the kinds of people that are talking about that already. I think some of the other places that people are talking about that are around particular kinds of infrastructure. So for example, there's been a lot of conversation about offshore drilling. And we saw some interesting upsets, some seats flip in New Jersey and Florida and California and South Carolina, where those folks were specifically talking about stopping offshore drilling. It's, you know, kind of it's a referendum on Trump and on Interior Secretary Zinke, who were trying to push an opening.
These were Republican seats not going to be held by Democrats in coastal regions.
Across the country, so not just on one side of the country, but on two sides of the country. And I think that's also really important to watch.
South, North, and West.
That's right, yeah. A couple of interesting races. I was really interested in Florida in particular, where Curbelo, who has been kind of framed as a climate champion, he's been a kind of co-leader of something called the Climate Solutions Caucus in the House, but that caucus has invited people into it who have been trying to dismantle the EPA, who've newly come to the idea that climate change is real. So I feel like that's a tough place to sell as a real climate solution caucus. He was voted out of office in favor of Muscarcel Powell. She's running on a platform. She actually comes out of a foundation that's looking at coral restoration. So really a person who understands science, understands climate change, signed the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge, and I think is really taking on this idea of greenwashing. So Curbelo had put...
greenwashing is...
Yeah, you're right. Greenwashing is kind of saying something's environmentally sound when in fact it's not. I think the prime example of that and the most dangerous example in the past year has been Representative Curbelo putting forward a carbon tax. That sounds interesting. We're all interested in that. But hidden in the language of that carbon tax were dismantling regulatory agendas and also making it explicit that oil and gas companies could never be held accountable for the impacts of their pollution. So in some ways it ties our hands, and it was a really low carbon tax. We're hearing from the IPCC we need $1,000 per ton taxes, not $40 per ton tax at this point. So I think that to me is a really interesting flip where we're seeing kind of the whole idea of what it means to really be a climate champion shift a little bit to a more progressive agenda.
So I'm really curious here, given the other conversation we had about the referenda around the country, and now talking about the House changing and what that can mean. Clearly, if you have to figure out where this goes, you have to take the long view.
That's right.
That there's not a struggle you win in the morning.
Yeah.
So talk a bit about that, where you see this kind of juncture between people who have won in the House, that are going to change the nature of things going on in the House, the referenda that lost, and some that won around the country, and that difficult struggle given all the fossil fuel money that's going in, and the need, which I think this young movement in America today sometimes forgets, of really on the ground organizing to take the stuff that people fight for in the House and will actually turn it into something you do on the ground.
That's right.
Right?
I think there are a couple of overlapping priorities, I would say. One is that certainly the organizing is an important and critical piece. I think we're going to see a lot of organizing in the next couple of years where we see climate impacts happening. So, you know, we saw some interesting shifts in Florida. We saw some interesting shifts in Texas, even though some of the races didn't flip. I think the idea that Beto O'Rourke got so far, that was a surprise for everyone. So while that's not a win in terms of flipping the seat, that's a win in terms of thinking about the agenda in some of those really oil and gas centered states. In Florida, you know, the race is too close to call. There'll be a recount, sure, and Gillum lost in terms of the governor's seat, but it was a pretty tight race.
Pretty
and
tight.
I think what we're seeing there also is that people are recognizing the impacts of climate change, and there's a little cognitive dissonance saying how do we elect someone who won't let us say the word climate change when actually part of our shoreline is going underwater? So I think really organizing in those places where we're seeing climate impacts and people are feeling the lived experience of climate change will be important. I think, as we talked about in the last segment, really starting to be able to map out, well then what are the alternatives if we're not going to do this fossil fuel economy? Where are we going instead is going to be super critical, and that's why I'm excited about this Green New Deal piece. But I think a part of that has to also be helping people understand why we can't keep expanding fossil fuel extraction. That's not going to be a winning strategy for us, and starting to build champions. And I think we build champions in that by really getting at this question of the money.
The money, as in the money that killed the referendum.
The money that killed the referendum, the money goes to elected candidates who then take a weaker stance on climate change or don't confront the fossil fuel industry. And while we're not going to change Citizens United tomorrow, we're not going to change the way election contributions happen probably in the next year or two. What we can do is build this coalition around things like the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge, where we're saying you don't get to call yourself a climate champion if you also take money from the people who are profiteering off of driving us down the path of climate destruction. I think it would be really interesting to see if we can expand that kind of definition of climate championship, not just to not taking money from the fossil fuel industry, but also saying, you know, I recognize that we can't actually expand fossil fuel infrastructure. So people saying no, like these folks have in Florida, South Carolina, California, no to new offshore drilling, no to new pipelines, perhaps no to new export terminals for gas. What does it look like when we actually take, I think we have to articulate what it looks like when we start taking climate change seriously, when we take these new global scientific reports that say we've got 10 to 12 years to turn this problem around or we're cooked. That's not a big time frame. 2 years of that will be setting up for this next race, and we've got 8 years left to figure out what the heck we're doing. So I think it's an organizing strategy. I think it's confronting fossil fuel money. I think it's really helping people connect climate impacts with the policies and the policymakers where they live.
It's, to me, having this conversation with you, Janet, is refreshing. I'm serious, because to take a long view that allows you to have a positive view of the struggle that's going to take place, who these new representatives are, what it means that some of the older progressive people in Congress will now chair committees, and that helps the kind of the tip of the struggle for changing the way we do energy.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And puts it at the forefront.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing, and I think what part of these new wins tell us is that people who are in the decision-making roles, setting the roles both at the state level and at the federal level, are starting to wake up and see that there's something happening around the country. And certainly we're seeing a lot of polarization, but we're also seeing a lot of resistance to fossil fuel infrastructure exploding across our country. And that resistance is exciting. I think it's sometimes unnerving for people. It's powerful. And I think the question is, how can our decision makers grab onto that power and be propelled by it as opposed to rejecting it? And I think that's part of our role in the environment community, is to really help those people understand and help new candidates understand that this is a fight for our lives and people are dedicated to it, and we will put our bodies on the line, but we will also bring our votes to the polling stations as well.
Janet Redman, thank you so much for coming to our studios today here at The Real News. Great to have you here. It was a great, important, positive, and thoughtful message you brought to us.
Thanks
I appreciate
so much.
it.
It's great to be with you. Thank you
so much. Our guest this hour, not this hour, but in this episode has been Janet Redman, who is the Climate and Energy Director for Greenpeace USA. And I'm Marc Steiner of The Real News Network. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.